Good morning, HIST 259. Hope you're doing well. This is the last video lecture of the semester. It's been fun, and the point of today is to sort of just wrap up the course by talking about some of the legacies, which is of course the name of the chapter that I asked us to read for today, or first part of the chapter that I asked us to read for today. And to try to leave you with some ways of thinking about the effects, the long-term results of the American Revolution on American society, looking forward into the 19th century. Chronologically, this video lecture will begin to kind of straddle the official ending chronological time period for this class, which is 1800. And that's something we talked about last video lecture when we talked about partisanship and the election of Thomas Jefferson to the presidency. So the point of today really is to, again, give us ways to think about what American society would become in the 19th century. And there's really two areas that I want to discuss that are also discussed in this chapter, Legacies, or two topics, I should say. One is women and the experience of women and the sort of first inklings of a women's rights movement, one could say the earliest origins of feminism. And secondly, to talk a little bit about slavery. And of course, both of these subjects are discussed in other reading. For today, pages 435 to 475 in Alan Taylor, American Revolutions. I'm not going to talk about every topic that's brought up in this chapter, just for purposes of time. Although I do find, for example, the discussion about the effects of the American Revolution, so the ideology of the American Revolution, the social effects of the American Revolution on religion, for example, culture. I'm just going to focus on women and slavery today, the experience of African Americans. But before getting into that, just as a reminder, this will be the fourth or fifth reminder, continue to watch these. This is our last true video lecture, and continue to complete the discussion responses, and I will give you, as I've discussed on video and also written in emails, an A for the semester. This will be the unfortunate way we're wrapping up this very crazy semester. So today I'll just talk for about 30 minutes, keep it kind of short, and talking about the, again, legacies of the American Revolution. And I think the starting point for us, and this is a theme that I brought up all the way back to when we were in class together and have brought up subsequently in several different contexts, is to think about the ideology of the American Revolution, this emphasis on liberty, equality, freedom, which we've talked about at some length, in a somewhat, I think, paradoxical way or contradictory way, because the legacies of the American Revolution were many, but when we look at the experience of women and African Americans, what I think we can see is that it being the legacy of the ideology of the American Revolution was, we might say, compromised, not necessarily hypocritical, but we might say not resulting in true egalitarianism, or in fact true equality. So let's start with talking about women, and the three primary sources that I assigned for this class are all pertinent to the experience of women. And I want to start with, before even getting into some quotes from text from Alan Taylor's American Revolutions, actually begin with the letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams. So we're going back chronologically in time from the date of March 31st, 1776. I think this is the best way to sort of begin thinking about the women's experience as a result of the American Revolution. So that date, March 31, 1776, and again, by the way, these are posted on Blackboard under the content tab, so if you want to pause for a second and pull it up, go for it now. I'll continue talking though. This letter is, in many ways, and for good reason, I think one of the most famous, certainly well-known letters to historians of the time period, and especially to the experience of women during the American Revolution. The date is significant, as I said, 31st March 1776. So this is a context, just if we're going back earlier into topics from about a month to 6 weeks ago. This is a time period, first of all, before the Declaration of Independence, right, which was officially issued July the 4th, 1776. This is a moment, the end of March / moving into April, in which, for example, fighting had begun, and the battles of Lexington and Concord, which we talked about, seems like a long time ago, but was about 7 weeks ago. It was a time period in which, for example, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which we read, was really beginning to have an impact on changing people's minds in favor of revolution, or I should say in favor of independence, the Declaration of Independence. And it's still a time period in which there is a lot that is unknown, very unsettled time period. And in this letter, Abigail Adams, the wife to John Adams, writes and discusses the possibility of what the revolution and what a potential independent United States would look like from the perspective of women. And so a little bit of context, and it's suggested in this letter, but John Adams was at this time serving in the Continental Congress, which was meeting in Philadelphia, which we've talked about. And so John Adams is a part of this Congress of elite white men who are making decisions on behalf of 13 colonies, which were not yet united in a declared independent nation. And the most famous part of this letter, and the link I gave you has several letters, so we're looking at the first letter, which is March 31st, 1776. The most famous part of this letter is that which begins, if you scroll down to almost the very end of the letter, and if you begin reading the paragraph, the third to last paragraph, that begins with, "Though we felicitate ourselves." This is where she makes a ringing statement on behalf of all women to her husband, who was one of the political leaders of the Continental Congress. She says, moving into the third sentence, after the two-line break, two-dash break, it says, "I long to hear," so I'm quoting from the letter, "that you have declared an independency," meaning that she's longing to hear that a Declaration of Independence will be declared. And by the way, in the new Code of Laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, this is the most famous part, I would desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous, and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So this is very strong language, of course, and it's usually interpreted by historians to be one of the first sort of statements of political, not just political consciousness by a woman, but the first statement of a suggestion that women could be a political body in and of themselves, right? And first of all, should be included in the new government that John Adams was a part of helping to create as a member of the Continental Congress. But that women could themselves be a political bloc, could be bloc BLOC, could themselves be a political force. And some of this language, again, just sort of jumps out in its aggressiveness. Abigail Adams writing to her husband, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, to create a rebellion. And the clearest political statement, we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Right? The same language that was used by American patriots, if we remember, going back to the middle of the 1760s, arguing against Parliament's imposition of laws like the Stamp Act. Right? or any of the other acts and taxes that we discussed going back to February, right? That male colonists argued that these laws were illegitimate because they had no actual representation in Parliament, no direct voice in them. And so Abigail Adams is using that same logic, right, but applying it to women. And as a starting point for thinking about Revolutionary era women's political activism, this is significant. But as we move forward in time into the 1780s, 1790s, and I'm now going to refer to some portions of Alan Taylor's American Revolutions, what we can see, on the other hand, is that the results of this sort of ideology of liberty, equality, the criticism of denial of representation, as it was applied to women in the context of the newly created American national government, especially after the creation of the Constitution, was something of a mixed bag, right? What we don't see as a result of the American Revolution is the enfranchisement of women across the United States. In fact, with only one major exception, the state of New Jersey, which is discussed in this chapter, women were denied the right to vote across the early United States in the 1790s. And in some ways, that fits in with the idea forwarded by people like Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists after 1790 that the United States would not be a democratic nation. Right? If we remember, most white men couldn't vote in the early republic. There were property requirements. So in a sense, the denial of the franchise to women is related to the general political trend in the early United States to limit the right to vote, to limit suffrage only to elite property-owning white men. But in another sense, of course, women were doubly burdened by the language of republicanism and the reality, right, of elitism in the government, because only in one state, as I mentioned, New Jersey, did women have even a limited right to vote. And this is discussed on page 455 of American Revolutions, and it's an interesting case because, as Alan Taylor notes on page 455, women gaining the right to vote in New Jersey was actually not intentional, meaning that the men who created New Jersey's state constitution in 1776 did not intentionally intend to enfranchise women. In fact, it was unintentional, and the limited right to vote for some women was only achieved through a loophole, which tells us quite a lot about even New Jersey being the one state that has an exception for women voting. Even in that case, it was unintentional and achieved sort of through the back door, if you will, to use that metaphor. So reading from page 455, I'm quoting here and now, in 1776 in New Jersey, the state constitution neglected to specify citizenship as male. Didn't gender citizenship in terms of the language of the Constitution, instead defining voters as all free inhabitants who met property and residence requirements, which qualified widows and spinsters, but not married women, still quoting. Some eligible women exploited that oversight, that loophole, to vote during the 1780s, which led the New Jersey legislature explicitly to accept the practice in a 1790 election law that referred to the voter as he or she. So that example, right, again, the one anomaly, the one outlier, the one state in which women could vote was in fact not intentional. And I think this is significant because it shows us that even though, again, the ideology of the American Revolution, the ideology of republicanism, that the people are sovereign, right, didn't, of course, extend in practice to all people. And in the cases that it did, it was unintentional. If we think about other aspects of women's experience in the 1780s, 1790s, another point to make, and this is pointed out a little bit in this chapter, Legacies, but I just want to make it a little bit more clear, is that at the local and state levels of government, local, say county and town, city government, and state government levels. Women continue to face discriminatory legal structures as it related to, for example, property ownership. Very difficult for women to own property independent of a man. And you'll note that in the section that I just read about those women that could vote in New Jersey, it's significant that that was women who were widowed, who were older and whose husbands had died, or spinsters, women who had never married. If they came into possession of property, legally they weren't tied to a man because they weren't married. They were older, therefore they could vote. But for the majority of women in New Jersey, but certainly across the United States, the right to own property is separate from a man. The right to legal structures that governed day-to-day married women's experience, for example, all of these were heavily skewed in favor of men. So another way of saying that is that the early American, at the local and state levels, legal system as it regarded especially married women was patriarchal. And yet there are a couple of areas in which we see, and most students, most historians of this period do see some positive change. It has to do with not voting and not formal political rights, but in the realm of education. And this is something that has been labeled by modern historians as the growth of a body of thought called Republican, as in the American Republic political system, Republican motherhood, term created by a 20th century historian, 20th, she's still alive, 21st century historian, 21st century historian, to describe the growth of educational opportunities for women in the 1780s and 1790s. So this is one area in which we do see some what we would consider now to be positive movement that benefited women. This concept of Republican motherhood was rooted in the basic idea that a republic, right, in which the people were sovereign, right, in which the people did not and need not be ruled, should not and need not be ruled by a hereditary aristocracy or a monarchy. The idea of republicanism as a political philosophy in the early republic, the 1780s and 1790s, was widely believed to be dependent on having an educated, virtuous, by which was meant unselfish citizenry. That the idea was a republic, especially a large republic, geographically large as the early United States was, demographically and culturally diverse, and in part racially diverse, but mostly demographically, ethnically, culturally diverse republic would fail as a political and governmental system unless the citizens, primarily meaning men, were raised as boys to be unselfish. Again, virtuous was the term that was used to describe unselfish citizens. And what that meant was that women needed to have a more direct role in training, raising Republican citizens, but in order to be able to do that, women needed access to more broader educational opportunities. And this is the context for a second document that I asked us to read for this week, so you can go and pull it up, pause it and pull it up on Blackboard, document by a man, Benjamin Rush, called Thoughts Upon Female Education. So go and pause if you want to pull it up, and I'm going to continue. So what this is Benjamin Rush, a member of the Continental Congress, actually a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a doctor, medical doctor from Philadelphia, became very active in promoting women's education in the 1780s and 1790s. So you can see on the link that I provided you that this Thoughts Upon Female Education was published in Boston in 1787. So this is right as the Constitution is being created and would shortly thereafter be ratified. So here he is thinking about, Dr. Benjamin Rush thinking about what a female educational regime would look like in a Republican system at a moment, right, when this Republican government was undergoing some significant change. Right? And I'm not going to read every single one of these proposals, which, as you can read, is just a list of proposals. These are the subject areas. These are the competencies that women should be educated in. But there's just a couple I would point out because it shows us both. It shows us two things, I think. One, it shows us that Benjamin Rush, who we would today consider to be somewhat of a progressive on social issues and certainly on women's education in the 18th century, he would have been progressive in his time. And yet some of these seem very misogynistic when we read through them, because they all assume, and this is a point that Alan Taylor makes in the chapter Legacies, but pages 452 to 458, one of the major themes is that the assumption, even from coming from sort of what we would call today progressive thinkers like Benjamin Rush, the assumption was that women would be and should be limited to the home, the domestic sphere, right? The idea that women should be out in the world practicing professions like men did was almost unthinkable to most people, the vast majority of people, even a sort of progressive liberal thinker like Benjamin Rush. And that's made very clear as you read through these proposals, right? Because they're all basically rooted in the idea that women's primary responsibility was the home and to raise children. They needed to be educated to raise good Republican citizens, but they must be in the home. And that's the context. So if we read the very beginning of this document, the very first proposal, it's the first Roman numeral number 1, makes this assumption very clear, right? The early marriages of our women, meaning the early in terms of their age, marriages of our women, by contracting the time allowed for education, by limiting the time allowed for education, renders it necessary to contract its plan and to confine it chiefly to the more useful branches of literature. So we say because women get married so young, and that limits the amount of education that they can receive in their late teens and early 20s, we'll have to just limit this educational plan to, quote, the more useful branches of literature. He next says, Roman numeral number 2, state of property in America renders it necessary for the greatest part of our citizens to employ themselves in different occupations for the advancement of their fortunes. So the state of property in America, if I'm translating this, renders it necessary for the greatest part of men to employ themselves in several different occupations in order to gain wealth. This cannot be done without the assistance of female members of the community. So he's saying that women do have a clear economic role to play in the creation of wealth for families. But then he says, they must be the stewards and guardians of their husband's property. That education, therefore, will be most proper for our women, which teaches them to discharge the duties of those offices with the most success and reputation. So women do need education because they are, again, stewards and guardians of their husband's property, but the education that they need should be limited to whatever helps their husbands become more successful and wealthy. So even here, he's framing women as a kind of adjunct to men, right? That women are there to support men, not to act as independent, necessarily act as independent economic actors. And he continues with these basic themes throughout this document. If you go to the beginning of the second set of Roman numerals, about a third of the way down, you begin to get into some of the more specific areas of education that he thinks are important for women. So I'm just going to talk about these a couple very quickly. A knowledge of the English language, perhaps that's obvious. Pleasure and interest to conspire, making the writing of a fair and legible hand a necessary branch of the female education. So handwriting lessons. Okay. He talks about a knowledge of figures and bookkeeping. These are all very specifically tailored to, again, this idea that women should support men, right? Not be themselves independent economic actors. Continues by noting that an acquaintance with geography is important, and some instruction in chronology, which is another way of saying history. So women should have a little bit of geography, a little bit of history, should read history, biography, and travels, not too deeply, but just enough to have a, quote, general acquaintance with them. Vocal music, he says, is important. Dancing, he says, is important because this is second Roman numeral number 6. Dancing promotes health and renders the figure and motions of the body easy and agreeable. So you can kind of get a sense for the way that even a progressive thinker thought about women's education, which is at a very limited scope, right? And this, in general, sort of encapsulates, right, the way that women were sort of stuck between living in a society which proclaimed liberty and equality for all, but yet which was clearly patriarchal. And this would continue to be the case for women moving into the 19th century. This goes beyond the chronological, I should say, limits of this class, which technically ends in 1800. But if you were to take or learn about the antebellum period of American history, from 1820 roughly until the Civil War, 1860, you would see that this general mode of treating women as theoretically equal, but in practice not equal, would continue. And I would just want to shift gears here and talk for just about 5 minutes, just quickly, to wrap up this discussion of the legacies of the American Revolution by talking a little bit about slavery. And obviously this is a topic that I've discussed at some length previously, and it's worth it now just to sort of bring up the topic now by way of just sort of wrapping up this short talk about the legacies of the American Revolution, because I think or at least I hope I made clear earlier in the semester, both in class but then also through an earlier video lecture, that the American Revolution, again, this ideology of freedom, liberty, theoretical equality, really burst the lid off of the question of slavery and anti-slavery, right? How is it that, for example, white men could talk about being enslaved, for example, by British imperial policy and yet hold others as slaves, right? And we talked about that contradiction with, for example, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Virginia slaveholders who were also leaders of the American Revolution. And in brief, this question of the relationship between a republican system which prized equality, for white men at least, and yet denied basic fundamental human rights to African Americans, would only continue to grow and become a deeper conflict in the years after 1800. And so I've already discussed, I believe this is 4 to 5 weeks ago, the rise of the anti-slavery movement in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, in Pennsylvania, and a little bit later in New York. During and immediately after the American Revolution, that topic is discussed in Alan Taylor's chapter, Legacies. He briefly discusses gradual abolition, which is a term that I've brought up and discussed again a little over a month ago. So the revolution, and again, this ideology, did unleash an anti-slavery movement. It did lead to the abolition, gradual, over the course of one generation, of slavery, first in New England, as I mentioned, and then Pennsylvania, and then in 1799, beginning in 1799, New York State. And yet, when we shift our gaze geographically to the south, when we look at Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and then the lower south states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and looking forward in the future after 1800 to the growth of the new slave regions that are now the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, that the ideology of the American Revolution certainly didn't prevent slavery from expanding and becoming, or stop slaveholders from becoming a more powerful political and economic force, right? So the American Revolution unleashed two paradoxically released two movements, okay, that could not be resolved. It unleashed anti-slavery, and it unleashed, or allowed at least, slavery to continue to exist and to expand, and therefore make slaveholders more and more powerful. And if we were to extend this class chronologically until the year 1820, at least, or to the Civil War, what we would see is this conflict between the forces of slavery and the growing force of anti-slavery would continue to intensify, eventually leading to the American Civil War. And I think the point that I would leave us here with this discussion of slavery is that the seeds for the American Civil War, which began in 1860, were in fact planted, to use that metaphor, during the American Revolution. That the American Revolution began a train of events or established conflicts that could not be resolved except for, as we know, the outbreak of a war which killed almost 1 million people. So I'm going to leave it there today, just to sort of thinking about what the American Revolution wrought, what kind of nation it created. I'm going, as I said, to post one last discussion board on Wednesday, and then next Monday, I'll just create a short video just to say goodbye to you all and good luck, and then I'll be posting our grades shortly thereafter next week. Okay, so I hope you all continue to be well. I will see you all for one last video next week. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you later.